Welcome to 312, the HRP Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Simmons, and I want to introduce this special episode of 312. In just a moment, we're going to be taking you to a conversation between HRP's CEO, Dan Titus, and Yvonne Alston, Chief Cultural Architect, CEO, and founder of Indelible Impressions. The subject of this conversation will be anti-discrimination and the challenges of harassment in the workplace. For those of you who have not seen Dan or Yvonne and some of the other content we've done at HRP, I want to take a quick moment to introduce them for you. Dan has been the CEO of HRP Associates for almost 7 years now, fulfilling that role through some of the most monumental changes and challenges in the history of the company and of the structure of the corporate world. Yvonne created Indelible Impressions to facilitate meaningful conversations, education, and training, ensuring that learning, upskilling, and resources for sustainability are accessible to as many individuals and organizations as possible. Yvonne and her team have collaborated with organizations spanning public, private, and nonprofit sectors, engaging with diverse disciplines and industries to authentically foster cultural understanding, community unity, and collective growth in prominent institutions and local communities. Regular viewers of the 312 podcast will know that we typically divide the episodes into a work hard and a play hard section, with the latter being available on YouTube as video. We're going to dedicate this entire episode to the conversation between Dan and Yvonne, which you can watch in full as a video on YouTube. Those of you listening out there will be able to hear the whole thing here still, but we want to let you know that it is available on our channel, which you can find in the links below. And now, Dan and Yvonne.
So, anti-discrimination.
Yes, really big topic. Big topic, important topic. Necessary, I think, on a personal level, professional level.
Yeah.
Really glad that we're having this conversation. Really important in the workplace.
It's especially important in our workplace because of the environment that we exist in.
Yeah.
You know, we're an engineering company.
Yeah.
Those of you out there who haven't figured that out yet. We're an engineering company, and, you know, in this space, it is a traditionally male-dominated space.
It is.
For sure.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, you know, of course, brings some particular issues along with it.
Yeah. And I think when we even think about that intergenerationally,
Sure.
right, is that how we defined the sexes.
Yeah.
How people saw themselves and saw their partners as such, right? Roles and responsibilities in the household, roles and responsibilities in the workplace.
Yeah.
That all plays into harassment. That all plays into, you know, how we communicate and how we engage across those elements of our identities.
Yeah. I mean, we're in this sort of, it's interesting sort of transitional period. That's kind of how I see it. It's a long transitional period, right?
Yeah.
But just sort of keying off what you were just talking about, like sort of traditional gender roles and, you know, that sort of thing, like, you know, the 1950s sort of style of doing stuff. Obviously, we're long past the 1950s. But even just in the last 15 to 20 years, the marketplace of this business has changed dramatically, right?
Correct.
The demographics are changing dramatically. So right now, you know, it's a statistical fact that there are more women graduating from colleges and universities with technical degrees than there are men.
Correct.
Across all ethnic backgrounds.
Yes.
And so, you know, when you're working in a space that requires, you know, advanced education, so engineering degrees and so on and so forth, you know, our hiring population, our available pool is dominated by women. And so, you know, we bring them into this organization and we start working on engineering tasks and whatnot. But because of the kind of engineering work that we do, we then end up stepping out into the world, into construction spaces, for example, right?
Yes.
Which still kind of look a lot like the 1950s in a lot of ways, right? So it's this
100%.
Yeah. So it's this I don't want to say crash, but coming together of a little bit of history and modern realities, and trying to negotiate that space in a way that is sufficiently appropriately protective of everybody's interests.
I agree. And so in preparation for this conversation today, you know, I'm really big into data, always have been. It matters. And what I was able to pull from a study done by the EEOC is there are about 27% of those specializing in architecture and engineering being women, right? And when we talk about the convergence of that with the construction industry, we see that they only make up 10.8% of the construction workforce and only 4% of those workers in the trade. It creates an opportunity in a prime ecosystem and environment for discrimination, right, of any sort, whether it is just based on gender or there's intersectionality there. So perhaps not only discrimination towards a woman, but a woman who perhaps looks a little bit like me, right, and has racial identifiers that actually compounds that experience for that individual. That said, if we're just to look at it solely from a gender perspective, we have to understand that, yes, while it's a male-dominated industry and that is changing, the attitudes towards women, the way that men engage with women in those settings hasn't moved as much as it should. And for organizations like HRP and others, it's not just an issue of the culture of an organization or an environment. It then leads into it's a liability.
Absolutely.
And it's something that has to be taken seriously, because what someone might see as being a small comment can have significant impact on the organization as a result.
Yeah, I think all true. And one of the things that is sort of frustrating for me in that sort of space, there probably are people who may be listening to this or watching this, because this is reminiscent of other conversations that are happening out there in I don't know, we'll call it pop culture. I am what I look like. And so, as I sort of engage with all of this, I have learned along the way that it's just amazing to me some of the things that I hear about or we encounter on the backside. So like if you have the perspective that, discrimination, so let's just talk about sexism for a second.
Sure.
You have the perspective that sexism is not a thing and that women, young women are in particular, are not experiencing that in the workplace on a daily basis. Well, good for you. But you're probably disconnected from the realities of that workplace, because I still, I don't want to say weekly basis because that's probably too frequent, but on a monthly basis, am in front of issues that just make me go, really?
Still?
What? And I'm not talking about, small we'll call misunderstandings, somebody mislabels somebody or something to that effect. Not to minimize those things, not minimizing those things, but I'm talking about blatant and straight up
sexual harassment.
WTF kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It happens all of the time.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons that it's sort of hidden from view a little bit for a lot of people is, frankly, a lot of women don't speak up about it.
Yeah.
And that just sort of perpetuates, not to blame them, but it sort of perpetuates the problem, because people just, if it's not in your face, you're not really aware of it. And so you don't tend to think about it. So it's sort of almost like a hidden away sort of thing that's happening, I think, in workplaces. Which is one of the reasons I think it's important for us to do stuff like this, is just to sort of shine a spotlight on it and call it out and say, look, this is a real thing.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking to this from my own personal experiences.
Yeah.
Directly.
Yeah.
Or at least when I say my own personal experiences directly, I mean my personal experiences with HRP staff who are experiencing harassment, working through the HR aspects of it, documenting, reporting, interviewing, doing all of bringing in the HR attorneys, like all of those things.
Sure.
And looking at, transcripts, for example, of things that were said or whatnot. And just going, again, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've hit on a couple things.
Yeah.
So one of the key points as to the facet of women not reporting and bringing these things forward when it relates to sexism. Something that is near and dear to my heart that we've talked about for the work that Indelible has done with HRP over the years is psychological safety.
Yeah.
If you as an individual, however you identify, but adding the element of gender into it. As a woman, don't feel that your voice is going to be heard, that you're going to be taken seriously when you say someone said something or someone alluded to something or made a gesture that made me feel uncomfortable. As a woman, it's not that I'm a snowflake or I'm overly sensitive. It is that it violated some norm that I have, right? Something that I hold to be a core value that you have then violated, right? If I don't feel like I can go to my leader and say, hey, so-and-so said, I was on a job site, I was out in the field, and I was working with a subcontractor, and these comments were made, and it made me feel really uncomfortable and unsafe physically, then what would be the point of me saying anything?
Sure.
Right? So you have to be able to feel psychologically safe in order to hold people accountable. So without the safety, it is very difficult to have the accountability.
Yeah.
Right? And this is where both education meets state of heart and mind, right? Is that for yourself as a leader, any person, right? Understanding the implications and what that means to be discriminated against when it comes to an immutable trait, right? Yeah. Gender being one of those things, unless there are, things happening within the individual and they feel, that they might be transgender in some way, so forth. Sure. But for those who I will say that feel female, very much female, it is very hard to reconcile that somebody else would say something that would be such an affront to my identity, that they felt like they had justification to say something that could be so utterly offensive, and to feel that there are no repercussions for that, even when you might respond in a way that lets them know that they've crossed the line and that something was offensive, or you felt that that was inappropriate, and you try to do so in a very non-confrontational way, and they are intentionally electing not to acknowledge your feelings about that or to respect the boundary that you set forward. It's tough. Yeah. It's really hard. And when you think about the positions of power that might play into that, if it is, let's just say, a male leader who is more inclined to sweep that under the rug, make excuses for the other individual, heck, perhaps it's even that individual who's making the comments and doing things that makes the woman feel uncomfortable and unsafe. What are you supposed to do with that?
So the safety aspect of this is another, sort of to be clinical about this, is another interesting aspect of the problem from an organizational perspective. This is something that I've had to wrestle with on behalf of this organization in the last few years. So, if you are not the person who is inclined to be the harasser, and you're coming at it from a different perspective, like what I would consider an appropriate perspective, your inclination is to try to create a safe space for people to be able to report these things, to talk about these things, to get some support, and all of that stuff. Yeah. One of the things that we're become much more aware of in these intervening years is that even that is a nuanced and difficult space. Because if you, for example, have like a zero tolerance discrimination policy, which we do, and somebody is discriminated against, right? There's in that person a weight of responsibility for going to, say, HR or some, a supervisor or what have you to report it. Yeah. Understanding that, for example, there's a zero tolerance policy, not wanting to be responsible for what, as a consequence, will happen to the person who did the discriminating.
Committed the infraction. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so we have experienced people really struggling with trying to get in front of the situation and get, the relief that they need from bad situations, while also not feeling like they own the problem and it's it's their fault that some negative outcome has happened to, the offender. And so, the sort of traditional, old middle-aged white guy sort of response where, you want to be the big brother that just goes and shoves somebody into the corner and tells them how it is.
Yeah, cut the crap. Yeah.
It's often exactly the wrong response.
Agreed.
And, there's a whole lot of learning, personal learning and organizational learning, I think, that has to happen around that in particular, because creating the safe space is very, very nuanced and very difficult.
Yeah.
Right?
And people don't always know when they've stepped over the line.
Yeah.
Right. And so, to your point, not putting too much emotional labor on the affected, right, is important. So one, you hit the nail on the head with education. Mm-hmm. People need to understand. Sometimes people don't.
Yeah.
They're saying things. Maybe that was their household. Maybe that was their environment. Maybe that's their social groups, right?
Yeah.
And they all talk that way. It's locker room banter, right? And so it feels very appropriate, especially if in your social circles it's completely acceptable. And then you step into a new environment where you're saying, oh, okay, all of a sudden it's not acceptable. Well, it's hard to reconcile that in moments, right? And so I think that education piece is so critical. And then you have the accountability piece, and to be accountability partners of one another, so that when things are said, it's not this immediate visceral response of, oh my gosh, now I hold somebody's career and livelihood in my hands if I go and report this to HR.
That's a lot to carry.
That is a lot. Again, it puts an additional emotional labor
100%.
Upon the individual who's been impacted and negatively affected by this. So the education piece is not just on the what do you say, what do you not say kind of thing. It's also for everyone to understand, how do I respond in real time when things are said and done that make me feel unsafe, that I'm coming to it from a perspective of, number one, making sure that I feel good, right, and I feel safe, but also in care of the other individual, that perhaps they made a mistake. Perhaps they were a little bit reckless or unthinking or insensitive in what they said. And so is there a way to have dialogue with them to say, this might have been your intent, to ask that question first? What did you mean by that? Right? And then giving the person the opportunity to say, well, what do you talk about? Well, when you made the comment about me being out in the field and perhaps about something I was wearing or whatever the case may be, because it's not always super overt either. It's the subtleties, right? And sometimes it's the continued subtleties that wear on a person. And so being able to ask a question and have the person have a moment of self-reflection to realize that they've overstepped a line or a boundary. For the person who was affected to feel a sense of empowerment, that I can self-advocate in this moment and say, hey, so let me just explain to you what that felt like for me. Right? And to be able to say that, and hopefully for that person that committed the infraction to make amends very quickly, and for you and that person to be able to move forward, and for you to be able to establish those boundaries. But it is not meant inherently to be punitive as much as it's meant to be educational and still relationship building under the guise of accountability partnership.
So that brings up again some more difficult nuances, right?
Sure.
Really what we're talking about is for, the person that's been, victimized, the aggrieved person is creating a sense of agency or empowerment, right?
Yes.
And if you really, stepping aside just from empowerment, but the idea of agency, if you step into that, really step into it deeply, right? What you're saying is, number one, you want the person to feel that they're empowered to do something about it. But then number two, in the context of agency, that they have some say in the outcome. Right? What should happen here?
Right.
That's agency.
Yes.
Right? What should happen here?
Right.
And from an organizational perspective, that creates a lot of difficulties.
Yes.
Because, for example, well-meaning HR law doesn't necessarily create agency for somebody who's been victimized in the context of sexual harassment. So if the organization has a zero tolerance policy, right, then it is what it is.
Correct.
And if you deviate from that policy, then you have created a liability.
Correct.
On a forward-going basis that from an organizational perspective is not sustainable.
Yes.
Right? But in order to effectuate that, you have to basically take some of the agency away from the victim.
Yes.
And that's exactly the wrong thing to do from an interpersonal or employee engagement perspective. And so there is a lot of, I think, nuanced and deep thinking that has to go into how to manage those spaces in a way that prioritizes the person that has been aggrieved, gives them agency in the outcome, and simultaneously doesn't run amok of certain HR laws.
Yeah, and protects the organization. And so the balance of that from where I sit, right, is both things can be true at the same time.
100%.
So you can have that agency and have that conversation and then come back to HR and say, this is what occurred.
Yep.
This is how I handled it. And I feel satisfied. It was a sufficient outcome in this moment for that. Now, if this continues, we're going to have to take it the next step. That's what I feel is appropriate. And I understand that HR feels that that's appropriate as well.
Sure.
Right. But I think that it's not an or, it's an and situation so that both things can happen so that the individual feels that protection and the organization has its protections as well.
Yeah. And so for like an organization like ours, right?
Sure.
As difficult as all of those things are that we just talked about from an internal perspective, and they are, right? We have this added complication in that we're sending our female employees, female staff out into the world where they are supervising, managing, directing, overseeing other companies, other contractors. So, you know, it might be an excavation contractor, for example, that we have hired as a contractor to perform work. And they could be out there, you know, telling people what to do and where to do it and how to do it and when to do it, and can run into, you know, traditional harassment sort of situations, but from the other company. Right?
Yeah.
And so now that gets really complicated, right?
Sure.
So all of the Highline principles need to still apply, right?
100%.
100%. But trying to negotiate in that space and get your aggrieved, you know, employee where they need to be with, you know, the right sense of empowerment and agency in another organization that you don't have affirmative control over is also interesting at times.
I agree with you. I think this is where, when we're thinking about our partnership structures, right? And making kind of some of this part of that, if you will, social contract between entities to say that this particular facet is part of our core values. And if we're going to partner together, we understand that, you know, you might have your own culture, certain things might be acceptable for you, but they're not acceptable for us.
Yes.
And when we are partnering together and we have employees on your job sites or partnering together as subcontractors, whatever that might be, for our employees, our code of conducts and our core values are going to prevail. And try to, at least on the backside of things, try to make those agreements. And again, to ensure that people feel empowered in that moment to stand up for themselves and even to stand in the gap for others, right? When situations come up and they happen, you don't necessarily have to be the aggrieved party to feel a sense of protection through the spirit of empathy and compassion for others, to step in and say, hey, that's not okay. That wasn't an appropriate comment. That wasn't an appropriate gesture that creates an unsafe environment. And you're not for that. We're not for that. So let's stop that behavior, stop that communication right now.
100%. And I actually think that in all of this stuff, this morass, right? That in particular is one of the most important things that people need to learn, need to understand, need to grapple with, right? Like you need to mentally prepare for.
Yeah.
Right. The most powerful thing that you can do, HR laws aside, reporting structures, talking about subcontractors, we have this whole procurement process where, we get our values and, minimum threshold performance requirements, including on these sorts of metrics in front of them. And they have to sign them and agree to them and all that sort of stuff. So great. So it's all documented.
Right.
And yet the problems still persist. The most important thing that anybody can do, right, as a witness, is step in the middle of something.
Yes. Be an upstander, not just a bystander.
100%.
Yeah.
And there are precious few people who are ready to do that. They may think when they're, at home, in their safe space.
Anecdotally.
Yes. Well, I would be that person.
Yeah.
Because
but when the moment comes and the pressure's on.
Yeah.
And even worse, when other than but for this particular facet, I really like that person.
Yep.
Right? Or we have some camaraderie or, gosh, this is a client. It's not even a subcontractor.
Yep.
It's a client who's behaving this way. So money's on the line. This is where that non-negotiable and the moral compass needs to be uncompromising.
Yep.
Right. And I think that that's really hard. And again, I go back to that education piece, because for some people, it may not be just that they don't want to be an upstander in that moment. They may not know how to. Right. And what is the language and what is the posture that I take in those moments that can diminish conflict, right? That can allow us to continue in our relationship, continue in the work that's being done, and perhaps in some regards have minimal catastrophic impact to that versus just, having things go off the rails, have people go to, very hostile exchanges, what we consider in my world verbal violence in some regards, and could even end up coming to physical violence in some way. And so I think it's equipping people with, again, the language and the skills of how do you stand up for someone else? How do you stand up for yourself? And then how do you stand up for someone else?
Yeah.
And then what are we willing to put on the line?
Right.
In order to stand on our values? And what will, I'll say it for HRP employees, like what will HRP do to back me up if I am to take this moral high ground, if you will, in moments that are critical to a client experience or something that could be impactful to the organization financially.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so for you as a CEO, it is what say you to those people who might have a moment of like, geez, this could really hurt our relationship with this client if I address this behavior.
Yeah. So that's a very fair question. And I think that those kind of questions don't get asked often enough.
Yeah.
So from my...
Well, that's what I'm here for, Dan.
So sort of modeling here a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. Like I've thought about this a lot.
Yeah.
And I think, just sort of looking at, potentially a staff person or even somebody in another company who's sort of thinking about these sorts of issues. What would I do if I were in the situation where I had to act in the agency of somebody else?
Yeah.
Right. How would I interface on a job site to say to, somebody who's doing something inappropriate, like, no, that's not okay.
Yeah.
Right. How would you do that? Spend a few minutes thinking about that, because as much as people think about how it might happen to them, what would I do if it happened to me? I'm encouraging you to think about what you would do if it happened to somebody standing next to you.
Yeah.
Right. That's important. And I think that starting from there, to your question, there's sort of a natural escalation of that idea, right? So
Sure.
what would HRP do? What would the organization, what would I do in the agency of others when that happens to somebody in this organization? So let me just say out loud, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, we have a zero tolerance policy.
Yeah.
So if we have a client that is engaged in that sort of misconduct, we will have a very direct and frank conversation with them. Always a nuance. So is it, a big organization where it's a singular employee that can be dealt with on their side from an HR perspective, or is it a singular client where, the client is, the offending party?
Yeah.
So those are different.
Absolutely.
Right? But
context matters.
Probably the one where the client is the direct offending party is the one that people would generally be most concerned about. Like if we go after this entity and say, no good, that they're going to fire us. Okay.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep.
And that is one, I will say I'm not surprised, right? Because I've come to know you and understand your moral compass, your code of character. But I think that that's really important and for employees to know that, because when we talk about that element of psychological safety I mentioned a few moments ago, that feeling that, knowing that, right, that Dan's going to stand up for me and there will be no tolerance of this just because perhaps HRP has a high paying client, right? And or has partnered with this client for X amount of years, that there's still that zero tolerance policy exceeds our walls in a way so that we feel protected whenever we are functioning as an employee of this organization. To me, that is an extension of that psychological and thus physical safety of individuals. I will also say that when thinking about that as an organization for talent that is thinking about who they want to work with, and I often, don't frame just work for, right? Because employees work with organizations, not just for them. That's going to matter to me, is that understanding that this is an industry that is still very male dominated, despite all the education and the number of women coming forward out of academic institutions with the skill set and the abilities to do these types of jobs. I think it's them knowing like this is part of the moral compass of the organization, and that's the type of organization I want to work for. And then you even carry that over into retention. Yeah. Right. And so again, when we talk about what a larger scale issue this is than just a one-on-one interaction, than just an inappropriate comment said from one person to another person and that person's reaction, it has much bigger implications.
Yeah. This is, in a way, this is sort of seems, I don't know, maybe a little tone deaf, but also there's an issue of value here, not just values, but value, right?
Yes.
So
say that.
Yeah. It's about value, right?
Yes.
So, with a client, there's an exchange of value, right? We're delivering a service, they're paying us for the service, right?
Right.
And we're looking at that from like an accounting perspective, right? Like, are we making enough money on this? Are we making our margin, value, right? Well, if that client is abusing the staff that we've put to that project, and that staff becomes unmotivated, right? Doesn't want to do the work. Right. That changes the value equation.
Absolutely.
Right? So when I say something like, if we have a client that is not treating our staff the way that they need to be treated, not the way that we expect them to be treated, that's almost like another level, but at a basal level, the way they need to be treated.
Right.
That changes the value equation between HRP and that client.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that we need to know at the leadership level, because that changes the math, right?
It absolutely does.
The most valuable thing that we have, valuable, not values, not value now, but valuable thing that we have is our staff.
100%.
So that resource is the thing that we need to endeavor to protect first and foremost.
Absolutely. And then the value that they will or won't be able to deliver as a result of that environment. We talk about this all the time when we talk about organizational culture, toxic leaders, microaggressions, right? All of those eat away at the value that individual can bring to the table, because when you're dealing with situations of discrimination, or whether it's sexism or it's racism or any of the isms, right? That has an impact on how that person thinks and feels and thus behaves, right? And that has an economic value to their ability to be productive, innovative, creative, efficient, right? Effective. all of those things. So to your point, there is an economic shift that happens when employees have poor experiences, whether those are within the walls of the organization or with partner organizations.
100%. I mean, some of this stuff just makes me laugh because like it's so basic, right? And it just, the reason it makes me laugh is because it's so basic. It's a mystery to me how it's so hard for certain people to understand these concepts, right?
Yeah.
But you know, there's 1,000 different YouTube videos and books and speakers who talk about, you know, how do you increase morale, right? Like morale,
yes.
You know, you build a durable, you know, enthusiastic culture, you know, how do you like incentivize people, which is another way of looking at morale. Like how do you get the people that do the things that, you do or you need them to do them passionately with a sense of pride, with a sense of, you know, value. How do you do that?
Yeah.
Well, like at the most basic level, right? You make sure that stuff that demoralizes people doesn't happen.
You value
right?
them.
Right.
Right.
So if you like, even as like a little kid, you know, kindergarten level, if you're ostracized or treated differently, you know, when people are getting picked for kickball, I mean, there's movies from the 50s, you know, the kid that gets picked for kickball last, right, is demoralized.
That was me.
Nobody wants me on the team.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's a sort of totally offshoot here, but like one of my favorite commercials that not that there's many commercials anymore. It's a short, and I don't even remember what the product was, but it was this short video of this little girl who was in the back seat of her parents' SUV, and she had tried out for some team. I think it was a soccer team.
Oh, I think I just saw this recently.
And she said, I made the team, and she got all emotional.
Yeah.
Right? In a positive way.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's the most beautiful commercial,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So that's just basic humanity, right?
Yes.
So like there's I don't know, she's probably 8. Right?
Yeah,
so here's like a little girl who's just
Beaming.
blown away because
yeah.
she could be part of the team.
Yes.
Right? So like if you send people out into the world and you allow them to be treated like they're not part of the team.
Yeah, when you other them, essentially.
Objectified, demoralized.
Correct.
So on and so forth.
Devalue them.
Devalued.
Yes.
Devalued, right?
Yeah.
You are stealing away the value of the organization, of the individual.
Absolutely.
Of the project, all of the things, right?
Philosophically.
It's Basil.
Philosophically, it's a theft. Is it not?
Yeah.
In many respects.
Yep.
And so, wow, that is such an epiphany in this moment. And I think for the listeners or the watchers of this video to really sit with that for a moment, that if I'm engaging in a behavior that is othering, that is devaluing, diminishing an individual, their value to this organization, what they could bring to a role, to a project, etc. That's what I'm doing.
Right.
And that's weighty and that's significant, right? But I would challenge folks to really think about that, because that is essentially what we're doing when we do that. And there is a personal responsibility to that. And I would hope that reflection of something as weighty as that would cause folks to think about, like, you know, maybe I'm engaging in certain behaviors that are not innocent and are not small.
So, absolutely. Also, people are not necessarily good at looking in the mirror. That's just a condition of humanity, I think.
Yeah. Sometimes, like, it's part of the reason why Indelible partners with HRP and its clients, right, is to try to be that mirror for some folks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Still, there's a lot of people who are not going to get it, right?
Yes.
But that, for me, kind of rolls back to one of the things that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Thinking about what you would do if it happened to somebody standing next to you. Because again, as a baller move, right, being the person who is not the object of the bad thing that's happening.
Yes.
And stepping in and saying, right? Often will snap somebody's head back, the perpetrator.
The offender, yes.
To make them go, whoa, wait a a minute. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know, call it peer pressure if you want, right? Like can be a very powerful tool.
It is a powerful tool. I agree.
Thinking through how you as an individual might engage in that moment, right, can really change outcomes. Not just for the person that's being victimized, but also for the person who hasn't seen themselves in the mirror and doesn't really understand that what they're doing is making people uncomfortable. Right. Not just the person that, is the object of whatever it is they're delivering, but to the people who are standing around going, Jesus. Right? Say something.
And that happens, I think, in myriad experiences, right? That it's not that we're all responsible to police the nation, if you will, but the adage of being one's, and I'm going to gender this for a moment just because that's the language of this particular saying, but being our brother's keepers, right? Is that, yes, there is this, well, me, my little spoon, my little cup, like the things that are just important to me in protection of self. But I feel like as a society, in some regards, we've lost our way as it relates to protection of community.
Yeah, agreed.
And so I think one way, and you and I kind of dished on this a little bit earlier prior to coming onto the podcast, is personalizing that for oneself of, hey, yes, this is a colleague, but what if that was my mom?
Yeah.
What if that was my sister?
Yeah.
What if that was my partner, my spouse? What if that was my daughter? And that's when it's like, oof, that hurts. Now it's personal for some folks, right? And sometimes that is that snapback moment for some folks. Sometimes it's that bitter medicine that allows people to be like, okay, yeah, I talk and I engage this way, but I never thought about it from that perspective. If somebody else was talking to someone I loved and cared about that way, that's not okay, and how that would make them feel. And oh God, and now I'm part of making someone feel that way, like, not okay.
Yeah.
And so there's that facet as well. So it is this, what is a responsibility we have for one another, with one another, that we all need to reflect on and decide within ourselves. And then the larger context of, I'm a part of this organization, and this is what this organization requires of me, and this is non-negotiable for them. Yes. And so it has to be non-negotiable for me too, because that's where it's at.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, even though people have moved to digital realities and are living in isolation, it seems more so than they used to.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is that people are social animals, and, except for the proverbial, man living in the mountain all by himself, the hermit.
Yeah.
Like, that's not really most people's reality. Even if you spend most of your time, living in a digital world, you're still part of some sort of a community.
Yeah.
And these are just simple old ideas. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Like, I mean.
Yes. And if I might give a slightly different take on that, that was known for the longest time about the golden rule, right? And now the platinum rule is that you treat others the way that they would want to be treated. And the reason for that is, we know in society, some people don't treat themselves very well.
Fair.
Some people, right, their threshold and their tolerance levels for inappropriate behavior is very high.
Yeah.
And they're okay with it. Right. So if you're one of those people, I don't want you treating me the way that you would want to be treated, because how you might want to be treated and your tolerance level for certain things might be very different from my own.
Fair.
And so for that, I would say that's where the platinum rule applies. But that also requires something, right? That requires that you actually get to know the person and you're not looking at them surfacely only as something that you can see, or a particular role that they might have in an organization as a partner, or even in society.
Yeah.
That you actually see that person as being a human being worthy of dignity and respect, no matter how they identify.
I will say, whether it's the golden rule and we're evolving to the platinum rule, point taken, sort of all the way back to one of the things we're sort of talking about at the very beginning, I'm just telling you, often when we run across these situations where they're occurring and we're looking at, again, like transcripts or whatnot of the things that were said, there is no great mystery in any of this. These are not subtle transgressions.
Sometimes they're very overt. Yes.
Mostly they're pretty overt.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so for that, there needs to be consequences. There are ramifications for this.
So most of the stuff that we experience at this particular point in time, so like, again, sort of looking at the 1950s, the Archie bunker, the manager chasing the secretary around the desk kind of concept, right? Like we don't see that often, almost never.
Yeah.
It's more language.
Yes.
And it's more
sweetheart, cookie.
And more than that.
Yes.
But yes.
Yes. And then I get angry and I call you all kinds of expletives that are gender specific, racial specific, whatever, something that is an attack on some facet of one's identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is blatant. And there's no parsing that.
So
there's no interpretation or misinterpretation of that.
So regardless of platinum rule, golden rule, regardless of your own personal tolerance, like, if somebody calls me sweetheart or something, that doesn't happen very often for the record.
Aw. Well, maybe on the home front, and that would be appropriate.
Sure. But like, maybe that's something that I personally would be like, nah, whatever. Right.
Yeah.
But it still registers.
Yes.
Right. So like, even if your personal tolerance for it, whatever that is higher, the things that we're generally talking about here, I still think, unless you're just completely unaware, still hit if you're hearing it happen.
Yes.
It must.
For some, but again, people are socialized differently. And as much as it seems, right, on the surface that this is no-brainer, this is standard, right, across communities, unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Yeah.
And so we have to contemplate that, which is why I think, again, I go back to the education piece. What might seem normal for one may not be normal for another.
Yeah.
And so there is a certain amount of latitude and nuance to that we have to give folks, but also understanding once we've educated you and once you know what it is, you're accountable to that thing. Well, and that's the zero tolerance policy. That's when it becomes uncompromising in its application. Not to say that it's malleable, but to at least contemplate the human condition that not all people have learned this in their lifetimes.
But I will say, though, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Of course, I agree with you. But I will say, it's still, I don't know, sometimes, and I don't, I'm not trying to castigate anybody here to a certain particular space, but it still defies explanation for me sometimes because like just, my own personal experience, like I'm the things. I grew up in a locker room and I'm a military guy and like I'm all of those things. So like if there was a person that you would point to and say, that might be the one that doesn't hear it or doesn't understand it or doesn't get it. That would be a fair way to sort of,
but there's book cover.
Hang on, without knowing me. Okay. Like that would be a fair way to sort of point and say he might be the one. Right?
Yes.
So when I'm looking at these things and I'm going, really?
Yeah.
It's very, 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 very hard for me to understand how somebody else, regardless of where they were brought up or what they were taught or whatnot, also doesn't see these things. It's very hard for me to understand that.
It's so, I mean, as somebody who deals with people from all different walks of life and all different lived experience, as much as professional expertise coming together in an environment where you're different, there's just no monolith as it relates to people's level of self-awareness and social awareness when it comes to certain things. If that was the case, we would probably not be dealing with majority of the social ills that we're dealing with right now. But there's also for some people.
I think that some of this is about, like, we're just getting philosophical here, but like I feel like some of this is an issue of personal responsibility. Right?
I agree with that. I was just going to go there actually.
Because, we can say, oh, I was brought up this way, that way. Like There is nobody that does not understand, right, that you can't walk down, 114th Street in New York and just randomly walk up to somebody on the sidewalk and smack them in the face.
Yeah.
And say,
without consequences.
Well, that's just the way I was brought up.
Yeah.
Like that, it's not a thing.
There will be consequences. Right? They might be driven to still do the thing, and yet there are still consequences for that, right?
Sure.
So there are some people who may decide it's worth the risk. I see that every day in my work.
Yeah.
Whether it's any forms of bias or bigotry that reside in an individual that come out. We were talking earlier about some work that I'm doing with one particular leader that said I was coaching them on certain things to do and not do. And they just looked me right in the eye and said, I'm not going to do that. And it was like, wow, and I'm saying to myself, like, in the person, like, do you understand the implications of not doing it? Yeah, I totally get it, Yvonne. And in certain regards, you're absolutely right. I'm not questioning that. I'm not even arguing with that. I'm just not going to do it. And I was just like, but here's all the requisite evidence you need to have the better version of yourself do these things. And yet you're telling me that you're making a conscious choice not to, when you know that the outcome or the result is harm. And yet this person, they took this position and it baffles.
It just hurts my head.
It hurts my head. Moreover, quite frankly, it hurt my heart because I was thinking to myself, like, you're in a leadership position and given what your organization does, like, I don't understand why this isn't naturally intuitive for you, or at least at a minimum where we're identifying this as an opportunity for growth for you and you're not just all over that. But that said, it goes back to that sense of agency we talked about.
Yeah.
That people decide for themselves, I get to choose. I get to choose how I'm going to show up in any given space. And I'm going to choose what feels right for me, even if that doesn't feel right for someone else. And I'm willing to take that risk. Or they might not even be thinking of it that strongly and that overtly. It's just a reaction in them. It's just what they do. Again, I often like to think because they've been socialized to think that that's okay. And it's not until there are significant consequences that they change their behaviors accordingly because it has cost them something. Yeah. It has cost them something dear. And for some people, that's being written up and that's enough. It's being called to their attention and understanding the negative implications on the other person, and that's enough. And for others, it's got to be walking papers. Sure. But the accountability part needs to be there with consistency. And when I think about HRP's values, right, and we did this program, slightly over a year ago about HRP's values, and they were rooted in things like trust, integrity, accountability, empowerment, value. That is an encapsulation of everything that we've talked about here today. And what is the responsibility from a culture commitment within HRP's walls that extends outside of its walls and as a bigger part of its sustainability mission overall? And I think it's amazing that for an organization of your size, that you're taking this as seriously, that we're embarking on this new kind of campaign, if you will, around anti-harassment, whether that is sexism, whether that is racism or other forms of bias that come into the workplace and in the working dynamics, whether that's office space or out in the field, carpet to concrete, right? Doesn't matter where it is, right? Thank you. You got that one for free. But seriously, no matter where people's feet shall tread, that they are responsible for themselves as there is a level of accountability, partnership with their fellow humans. Yes. And so it does my heart good to know that this is at the forefront, this is mission critical, and that it is non-negotiable as a value of the organization as well as a demonstration of how you value your employees. So I just want to ask you Just real quick.
This is the question hour.
This is the question part. No, this is going to be so good. I'm
getting sweaty palms over here.
No, never. So, when I think about you, and you as CEO of this organization,
good God,
yes, how will you personally lead by example when it comes to creating this inclusive culture within the walls, outside of the walls, when it comes to sexism, ageism, racism, every ism kind of that is out there, anything that subjects another person to mistreatment verbally or physically?
Yeah. So I think at the most elemental level, the thing that I can do the best is just articulate how I feel about these things. It's my job, it's my function in this organization to set the tone.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So setting the tone is about saying the things out loud. And I, Dan Titus, am anti-ism, period.
I love that. We should get you a bumper sticker.
Anti-ism.
Yes, I am anti-ism.
I am anti-ism.
Yes.
I am not interested at all in the idea that there is differences or differentials between people that are a cause for them to be discriminated against. I don't care what your background is, or race, religion, color, sex, creed. I don't care.
All the things.
Everybody in my mind is created equal.
And worthy of that dignity and respect.
Worthy of that dignity and respect.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. I love that. I was also thinking of other conversations you and I have had, both as leaders of our organizations, community leaders, et cetera, of modeling the behaviors that we want to see. And that is, I think, so critical, more than anything that we could ever say.
Yeah.
It is what we don't see, but what we do.
Yeah.
That helps other people understand, number one, that it is not just intentional, but authentic to us.
In part, that's why I think doing this sort of stuff is important.
Yeah.
Because, listen, given the nature of this particular organization, we have offices all over the place.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't have contact with me on a daily basis.
Right.
That's not my daily function. So,
sure.
From a modeling perspective, like a runway perspective, I don't think that a lot of people in the organization get to actually see how I interact with people. Correct.
That's very fair.
Because they might be in some other completely removed location, and they might not necessarily know it if they ran me over in the street. please don't do that. But and so I think that that's why creating the narrative and doing things like this and setting the tone and saying the things out loud and doing it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Is probably the best vehicle for me.
Sure.
In this particular organization.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the beauty that, as I've come to know you, is that much like myself, you hold yourself accountable to be you everywhere your foot shall tread. So if people do see you out in community, there's nothing you would say or do that is contrary to your content of character when you are functioning as a CEO. The CEO Dan Titus is the same as Dan Titus.
What you see is what you get.
Neighbor, the spouse and partner, the father, the uncle, the whatever, right? You are who you are.
I like to think so.
Yes. Yeah. And that consistency of character piece is critical to this. And so I think that's an additional encouragement for folks, right? We were talking earlier about how people might be. Most of the time, people, who they are in the workplace is often reflective of who they are at home.
Yeah.
But sometimes there is a difference there. And sometimes there really should be a difference there. But I would like to think that there are things that you can learn in the workplace like this that will carry with you when you go back into homes and community and neighborhoods and all of that, and hopefully in the positive, vice versa. So if you wouldn't talk to, let's just say from a sexism standpoint, right, you wouldn't say those things to your wife or your daughter, and you doggone sure wouldn't tolerate anybody else doing it, then you don't do it when it's a coworker or another subcontractor or vice versa. If you
100%.
wouldn't tolerate it there, you don't tolerate it in the workplace whether that's carpet or concrete.
100%.
Right. And so it's that consistency of character piece that is so critical, but it does require that self-reflection and does require that personal accountability standpoint.
Yep.
And it better you hold yourself accountable than to have an organization or someone else hold you accountable. I will say that.
True.
But it's good to know that HRP, if required, will do that
100%.
Without reservation.
Without reservation.
And so I appreciate that so much. This has been a great conversation.
That's it? That was the only question?
That was really the only question I had
All
for
right.
you, because we really touched on everything else. And I think that in the work that Indelible is doing with HRP and what we're kind of teasing out a little bit of what we're going to be embarking on in 2025, this is a great primer for what is to come.
Yep.
And so there will be education that's happening. There will be some campaigning around this that makes it not just a nice to have, but an absolute imperative in the organizational culture. And so I'm really excited about that and excited about your advocacy for this and the sustainability of it overall. So kudos.
For my bit, like, here at HRP and my personal story here at HRP, one of the things that I have always really appreciated about this organization was that I was able to come here and be myself.
Yeah.
My authentic self.
Yes.
With all of the warts and whatever else, the things.
And all of the good too.
Sure. But it's important to me that tradition persists and that, the people who are here now, behind me is not really the right word, but, in the organization should have the same experience, should be able to come here and be themselves.
And that's part of your legacy.
Yeah. So that's very important to me.
Excellent. Excellent. Love that. Thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. It was good.
Yeah.
Liked it.